She barely had enough to feed her son, and when the plates hit the floor, the laughter echoed louder than her own silent tears. But everything changed when the screech of tires shattered the night, and she found herself pulling a stranger from a burning car. If you want to hear more about how fate can change in an instant, hit like and subscribe for the full story. The diner was dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent bulbs above casting long shadows across the cracked linoleum floor. The air smelled of grease and stale coffee, a blend that somehow comforted those who made the greasy spoon their second home. Behind the counter, Ellie wiped down the already clean surfaces, her movements mechanical, as if the repetitive nature of the work had worn her down to something smooth and predictable. She wasn't used to complaining, but tonight, after yet another string of little failures, it was hard to pretend everything was okay. She picked up a tray of plates, but as her hands reached for the stack, they trembled just enough to make her nervous. The stack of porcelain wobbled, and before she could catch it, it came crashing to the floor with a sound that filled the entire diner. A hush followed, the kind that always happened when you made a fool of yourself, when everyone knew you were just one mistake away from falling apart. A chuckle came from the corner booth. One of the regulars, an old man with a face full of too many years and too many complaints, had his hands wrapped around his mug of coffee, his gaze fixed on her with that familiar, judgmental look. He wasn't the only one. The other patrons looked up, then went back to their conversations, not bothering to hide their amusement. They didn't know her, none of them did, but somehow it didn't matter. She could feel their eyes on her back, and it hurt more than it should. Ellie bent down to scoop up the shattered pieces, trying to ignore the burning shame creeping up her neck. She had been here too long, had sacrificed too much, just to keep things afloat. It felt like a lifetime ago, when she had stepped into this role, eyes full of hope, ready to change the world. Now, it felt like she was stuck in a never-ending loop. Drop plates, get laughed at. Go home. Repeat. She forced a tight smile and apologized, but the words felt hollow, like they were slipping out of her mouth without permission. She wanted to yell, to tell them all how much she hated being the butt of jokes, hated how small she had become in this world of half-sentences and fleeting smiles. But there was no time for that. No time to lose. Her son, Jamie, was waiting at home. He needed her. She couldn't afford to care about anything else. The last plate was swept up, and Ellie took a deep breath. The evening would end soon, and she could forget about the mistakes. She could be someone else for a few hours, someone stronger. Someone who didn't let the world laugh at her. Maybe tomorrow things would be better. But right now, there was only the soft hum of the diner and the sharp sting of embarrassment she couldn't shake off. Ellie stepped out into the cool night air, the kind of crisp that made her feel small and exposed. The streetlights flickered above, casting weak halos of light on the cracked pavement. She pulled her coat tighter around her body, but it didn't offer much comfort. Her feet dragged along the sidewalk, the soft click of her boots a lonely sound in the silence. Behind the diner, the alley was dark, the kind of forgotten place where only people who needed to disappear came. She hadn't intended to end up here, but the weight of the evening had been too much, and she had found herself stepping away without thinking. There was no one to see her, no one to judge her in this quiet, empty corner of the world, no one but her own thoughts. The door to the diner had shut behind her with a heavy thud, and with it, all the noise and laughter and eyes that had followed her throughout the night. Now, there was only the sound of her breath, shallow and uneven, as she leaned against the brick wall and closed her eyes. She could still hear the clatter of the plates in her mind, still feel the heat of the laughter that had followed, sharp and unkind. It was always the same. She worked hard, did her best, but somehow it was never enough. She was never enough. Her hands shook as she dug them into her pockets, but it wasn't from the cold. It was the weight of the failure she couldn't shake off, the way she had messed up again, just like she always did. She let out a breath, letting it mix with the night air, and for a moment, everything felt like it was closing in on her. She couldn't even remember the last time she'd had a day that didn't feel like this. A day that didn't end with the sting of falling short, of being less than what everyone expected of her. There was Jamie, of course, and for him she kept going. But sometimes, just sometimes, it felt like she was disappearing, like she was vanishing into the background, her name slipping through the cracks of a life she couldn't hold together. She wiped her eyes quickly, not wanting to feel sorry for herself, but the tears kept coming, blurring her vision. It wasn't fair. She had tried so hard. She had sacrificed everything for Jamie, for this life she was building for them. And yet, there she was sobbing alone behind a diner, surrounded by the noise of her own heartbreak. A sound broke through the stillness, a sharp, sudden screech of tires, followed by a crash that made her heart jump in her chest. For a split second, everything went quiet again, and then the sound of metal grinding against metal filled the air, followed by the unmistakable hiss of something burning. Instinctively, her body moved before her mind could catch up. She pushed herself off the wall and rushed toward the source of the noise, her breath coming faster, her legs carrying her as if the world were about to crumble around her. The glow of flames reflected off the side of the building, and the heat hit her before she even reached the wreckage. The car was a twisted mess of metal, smoke pouring from it like something alive. She didn't question what she was doing. She couldn't. There was someone in there, someone who needed help. She couldn't just stand by and watch. The flames were licking at the edges of the car, too close to the person inside, too close to the man who was still trapped. His cries for help cut through the air, and she couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the panic. With her heart pounding in her chest, she reached for the door handle, pulling with everything she had. The heat was unbearable, but she didn't care. The man inside wasn't moving, and she knew that if she didn't do something, he wouldn't make it. With one final yank, the door gave way, and she dragged the man out, her hands burning but not stopping. She kept pulling until he was free, until he was out of the car, safe, but still unconscious in her arms. The heat from the flames was unbearable now, and she felt the world tilt as she stumbled back, falling to her knees, but not letting him go. The sirens came soon after, the distant wail growing louder as she held him, trembling, with the smell of smoke clinging to her clothes and the echo of her own breath in her ears. In that moment, she wasn't thinking about the diner, or the laughter, or the failure. All that mattered was the man in her arms, alive because she had done something she hadn't even thought twice about. Her mind raced, but her body moved on instinct. She couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop the adrenaline from coursing through her veins. And as she stared at the man she had saved, one thought rang through her head. She had done something she would never forget. Something that felt, for once, right. The fire trucks arrived soon after, their sirens still ringing in the night air. Ellie barely noticed them, still kneeling on the ground, her body shaking with the aftermath of what she had just done. The man she had pulled from the wreckage was unconscious, his face soot, smudged and pale, but at least he was breathing. That was all that mattered in that moment. The paramedics rushed over, taking him from her arms with practiced ease, their voices calm and reassuring as they worked to assess him. Ellie's hands were still trembling, coated with the remnants of smoke and ash, but her mind couldn't seem to catch up with her body. Her chest felt tight, her pulse racing, and it wasn't from the cold. A hand rested gently on her shoulder, pulling her attention away from the chaos around her. She looked up to find one of the paramedics, a young woman with a kind face, crouching beside her. "Are you all right?" the woman asked softly, her voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. Ellie nodded but didn't speak, her throat too tight to form words. She wanted to say something, wanted to explain that she hadn't meant to get involved, that she had just acted on instinct, but the words felt like they were stuck behind the knot in her chest. Instead, she just shook her head, unsure of what to say. The paramedic seemed to understand, her expression softening. She handed Ellie a bottle of water, which she took with shaky hands, grateful for the small act of kindness. Ellie took a long drink, her hands still unsteady, and then wiped her mouth, the taste of smoke lingering on her tongue. As the paramedics worked, Ellie couldn't help but glance over at the man they were loading into the ambulance. She had saved him, and for some reason, that felt like it should have meant more than it did. She didn't know him, didn't even know his name, but something about him had drawn her in, something beyond the desperation she had felt in that moment. She couldn't explain it, but she hadn't hesitated. Not even for a second. One of the officers came over then, his face hard to read in the glow of the flashing lights. He asked her questions show she had found him, what had happened, and she answered in a quiet, almost detached manner, her voice sounding distant even to herself. She didn't want to relive the details. She didn't want to think about how close the man had been to death, how close she had been to losing him. So, she gave short-clipped answers and tried to focus on the fact that he was alive, that she had done something that had made a difference. After what felt like an eternity, the officer seemed satisfied with her answers and walked away, leaving Ellie standing alone in the middle of the alley. The noise from the sirens was starting to fade, and with it, the sense of urgency. The street seemed quiet now, the chaos of the fire, a distant memory. Ellie looked around, unsure of what to do next. Her mind was still spinning, still trying to make sense of everything. She wanted to go home, wanted to curl up on her couch and forget about this night. But as she stood there, the events of the evening running through her head, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of emptiness. She had done something brave, something she hadn't even known she was capable of, but it didn't feel like enough. It didn't fill the space inside her that had always felt hollow. The sound of the ambulance doors slamming shut broke her from her thoughts. She watched as the paramedics climbed into the vehicle, the man she had saved lying inside, his form barely visible through the tinted windows. The ambulance pulled away, its sirens fading into the distance, and Ellie was left standing there in the night, her breath coming faster now that everything had settled. She didn't know what had happened to her tonight, but she knew that nothing would ever be the same. The man she had saved was gone, his life now in the hands of people far more qualified than her. But there was something about him, something about this night, that wouldn't let her go. And though she didn't understand why, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into a different life, one she wasn't prepared for. The days that followed felt like a blur, each one blending into the next as Ellie returned to her routine, her life marked by the quiet hum of the diner and the endless cycles of cleaning, serving, and pretending everything was fine. She had returned to her small apartment each night, her body aching from the physical work, her mind still trying to process the chaos of the previous evening. But the man from the wreckage lingered in her thoughts. His face burned into her memory, though she hadn't even caught his name. She had tried not to think about it, tried to shake the feeling that something had shifted inside her. It wasn't like her to act on impulse, to risk everything without thinking. But there she was, doing just that. She had pulled a stranger from a car wreck, and somehow that felt like it was supposed to matter, even though she had no idea who he was or why she had acted so quickly. The questions nagged at her, but she pushed them away, convinced they would only make her life more complicated. But then, on the third morning after the accident, a call came. She had been just getting the last of the laundry in when the phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet apartment. Ellie wiped her hands on her jeans and grabbed the receiver, the familiar voice of the diner manager on the other end. "Ellie, there's someone here to see you," he said. His tone was casual, but Ellie could tell there was something different in his voice. "Who?" she asked, wiping a stray hair from her face, her thoughts immediately jumping to the possibility of a customer or perhaps an issue with her hours. "A man, says his name's David," he continued. He's asking for you." Ellie frowned. "David," she repeated, but the name didn't ring any bells. "Is he one of the regulars?" "No, this one's new." There was a pause. "He's wearing a suit. You should probably come down." A man in a suit? Ellie felt a ripple of confusion as she hung up, unsure of what was happening. She didn't know anyone who wore suits not in her world. She wasn't used to people coming to see her. She was just a waitress, a single mom, with no connections, no reason for anyone to be seeking her out. Still, curiosity gnawed at her as she grabbed her jacket and hurried out of the apartment, making her way to the diner. She tried to push the strange feeling aside, focusing instead on the mundane thought of getting to work. But when she stepped into the familiar, greasy-scented diner, the sight of a man waiting by the counter immediately threw her off balance. He wasn't just any man, though. He was tall, well-groomed, and sharply dressed in a navy suit that looked like it had been made for someone who spent their days in boardrooms, not truck stops. His shoes were polished to a high shine, and the slight touch of silver at his temples only added to his air of quiet authority. But what caught her off guard the most was his face. He was the man from the fire. He was standing there, leaning against the counter with a calmness that made Ellie's heart skip. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, time seemed to slow, as if the world around them had shifted. The sense of recognition was immediate and unsettling. He looked just as she remembered, though he was far cleaner now, his suit and hair in perfect order. Still, there was something about him. The same quiet intensity, the same look in his eyes that had been there the night she saved him. "Ellie," he said, his voice low and smooth, like a well-rehearsed greeting. "I was hoping we could talk." She blinked, still standing frozen in the doorway. "Talk?" The word felt strange on her tongue, like it didn't quite belong in this world she'd spent so long trying to survive in. "Yes," he said, his expression unreadable. "It's important." Ellie felt a wave of unease roll through her. She hadn't asked for any of this. She had acted out of impulse, not knowing who this man was, and now he was here, in her world, asking her for something she wasn't sure she could give. She opened her mouth to say anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself stepping forward, unable to pull away from the pull of his presence. He motioned to a booth in the back, and after a moment's hesitation, she followed him. The soft clink of silverware and quiet hum of conversations filled the air as they sat down, and the world around them seemed to disappear, leaving just the two of them alone in this strange moment. "I owe you my life," he began, his voice steady but carrying an edge of sincerity she hadn't expected. "That night, you saved me, and I can't forget that." Ellie swallowed, her heart beating louder than she would have liked. "I was just doing what anyone would have done," she said quietly, her eyes drifting to the table as if the words would make it easier to breathe. "No," he said firmly, "not anyone would have done that. You risked everything, and I think you deserve more than a simple thank you." She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her mind racing. More? What was he talking about? The only thing she had was a job that barely kept her afloat, a son who depended on her, and a life that seemed to get harder every day. The man's eyes softened slightly, as if he could see the confusion on her face. "I'm David Hayes," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "I'm the CEO of Hayes Enterprises, and I'd like to offer you an opportunity." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What kind of opportunity?" David leaned forward slightly, his expression now a mixture of warmth and determination. "I want to offer you a job, a position with my company. I think you're someone who could go far if given the chance." Ellie stared at him, her mind reeling. This couldn't be real. This man, who she had saved without a second thought, was offering her something she couldn't even dream of, a chance to change her life. But the fear that had been simmering inside her all week flared up again. She wasn't meant for that world. She wasn't meant for anything beyond the diner and the struggles that came with it. "You don't have to say yes right away," he added, sensing her hesitation. "Just think about it. Whatever you decide, I owe you everything." As she sat there, looking at the man who had been a stranger only days before, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that this chance was about to change everything. Ellie spent the next few days in a haze, each one slipping into the next like a dream she couldn't wake from. She hadn't asked for any of this man, his offer, the confusion swirling around her, but now that it had been laid before her, it felt impossible to ignore. David Hayes, the man she had saved, the one who was now offering her a future she hadn't even dared to imagine, lingered in her thoughts like an uninvited guest. His words echoed in her mind. An opportunity. A job with his company. A chance for something more than the diner, more than scraping by. But as she sat in her apartment, staring at the unwashed dishes from breakfast, the reality of it all weighed heavily on her. She wasn't someone who belonged in that world. She didn't have the qualifications. She had no experience in anything beyond waiting tables and taking care of Jamie. The thought of stepping into that life, that world of polished suits and corporate boardrooms, felt like stepping into a different dimension, one she wasn't equipped for. She had kept the offer in her pocket, hidden beneath the weight of her doubts. She had barely mentioned it to anyone. How could she? How could she explain to people who barely noticed her, people who never thought twice about the woman who cleaned their tables, that she was being offered a chance to change everything? Jamie had been quiet lately, his bright eyes watching her more intently than usual, as if he could sense the shift in the air. He didn't ask questions, but she knew he was waiting for something, waiting for her to decide, to make a choice. But she didn't know what that choice should be. Was she really the kind of person who could walk into a world like that, one so far removed from the life she had built? She found herself pacing, unable to settle, the apartment feeling too small for all the thoughts racing through her mind. Finally, with a deep breath, she grabbed her coat and stepped outside, needing air, needing distance from the mess of decisions she had yet to make. The cool wind hit her face like a slap, but it was grounding, a small reprieve from the uncertainty that had started to consume her. She didn't know how long she wandered, just walking through the streets, letting her thoughts drift, trying to come to terms with what had happened. It wasn't until she reached the park, the one just a few blocks away from her apartment, that she realized how much she had been avoiding facing the truth. She sank onto one of the benches, her fingers clutching the edges of her coat. The world felt distant here, quieter, as if the park was a refuge from the noise of her own mind. The offer from David Hayes wasn't going to go away. It was there, lingering, a shadow in the background of everything she did. The thought of Jamie was enough to keep her grounded. He needed her, and that need had always been her compass, her reason for everything. She had promised herself she would be the best mother she could be, no matter the cost. But that promise had never included a life where she had to settle for less, where she had to keep sacrificing her own dreams just to survive. The weight of that truth hit her hard, and for the first time, Ellie realized she had been holding herself back. She had been convinced that she couldn't have both a better life for herself and a life for Jamie. But maybe, just maybe, David's offer was a chance to prove her wrong. Maybe she could have more than this. Maybe she could show Jamie what it meant to chase something better, to reach beyond the boundaries she had set for herself. She stood up suddenly, her heart pounding in her chest. It was crazy. It felt reckless. But when had she ever done anything without a little bit of crazy? She had acted without thinking the night she saved him. And look where that had led her. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if she would be able to walk into that corporate world and succeed. But she couldn't keep living in fear of what she might not be able to do. She was more than the diner. She was more than the woman people laughed at. She was Jamie's mother. And she was more than capable of standing tall in the face of whatever came next. With a deep breath, she pulled out her phone and dialed the number David had given her. The phone rang twice before he picked up, his voice as steady as it had been the first time they'd spoken. "Ellie," he said, his tone as calm as if they were continuing a conversation from just yesterday. "I'm glad to hear from you." She could feel her heart in her throat, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I've thought about your offer. I'd like to meet, to talk about it." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then a quiet chuckle, as if he'd been waiting for her to make the decision. "I knew you'd come around. I'll send over the details. Just say when, and I'll make it work." The weight she had been carrying for days seemed to lift, just a little. There was still fear, still uncertainty, but there was also something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Real hope. And for the first time in a long time, Ellie allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, something bigger than she ever could have imagined. Ellie had barely slept the night before, her mind a swirl of questions, but when the morning light crept through the small window of her apartment, she knew today would be different. She had made the decision, but now she had to follow through with it. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about proving to herself that she could take a step forward, that she wasn't meant to be stuck in the life she had known. She got Jamie ready for school, packed his lunch like she did every morning, but there was a different feeling in the air today, something lighter, a sense of possibility she hadn't felt in a long time. The diner was bustling as usual when she arrived, but the weight of the place felt different now. Ellie moved behind the counter with a quiet resolve, her movements sharper than before. She couldn't focus entirely on the work at hand, her thoughts drifting back to the decision she had made. She didn't even know what the meeting would look like. Would it be in some sleek boardroom, or would he take her to lunch and casually explain what the job entailed? She had no idea, but she knew she couldn't go back now. It had taken too much to get to this point. As the minutes ticked by, the bell above the door jingled, signaling another customer. She glanced up, automatically greeting the new face, but as soon as her eyes met his, everything else in the room faded into the background. There he was, David Hayes. He stood in the doorway, wearing the same sharp suit she had seen him in before, but this time there was something more relaxed about him. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, like he was waiting for her to make the next move. "Ellie," he said, his voice carrying the same warmth it had the first time they spoke. "I'm glad you could make it." Her pulse quickened, but she steadied herself. She nodded, not trusting her voice just yet. The noise of the diner seemed to swell again as the door shut behind him, the hum of the usual chatter filling the space between them. "Ready to go?" he asked, his tone casual, though Ellie could tell he was paying attention to every detail of her reaction. He hadn't asked her to dress up or put on any kind of show. He seemed to genuinely want her to come as she was. Ellie nodded, taking a deep breath. She had made the decision, and now there was no turning back. She told the manager she was stepping out for a bit and grabbed her coat. As they walked through the door, the cool air hit her face, the city stretching out before them, full of life and opportunities that had once felt so far beyond her reach. The drive to his office was quiet, but Ellie didn't mind. She watched the city pass by, the streets so familiar to her but now suddenly feeling foreign. It was almost like she was seeing it for the first time. They arrived at a tall building with gleaming glass windows, a structure that seemed to look down on everything around it, its sharp lines and sleek design in stark contrast to the greasy diner she had spent so many nights in. David led her through the lobby, and Ellie couldn't help but feel small. She had never been in a place like this before, not in any way that felt personal. It was cold, efficient, and polished in a way that made her feel out of place. She tried to focus on the sound of her shoes clicking against the marble floor, grounding herself with every step. When they reached the elevator, David pressed the button for the top floor, and as the doors slid closed, Ellie couldn't help but glance at him. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way he looked at her, something that told her he wasn't just here to offer her a job. There was a kind of understanding between them, something unspoken. "Are you nervous?" he asked, breaking the silence. His voice was light, but there was a sincerity in his tone. Ellie hesitated for a moment before answering. "I've never done anything like this before." "That's all right," he said, giving her a reassuring smile. "You don't have to have it all figured out. That's what we're here for." The elevator dinged, and the doors opened to reveal a hallway lined with large windows that looked out over the city. Ellie followed David as he led her into a spacious office, with walls lined with bookshelves and a massive desk that looked as if it had never been touched. The room was impressive, but it felt too big for someone like her. She tried not to let the nervousness show, but it bubbled inside her. David gestured to a chair in front of his desk, and Ellie sat down, taking in the view of the city stretching out before her. She tried to remind herself that she belonged here, that she was more than just the woman who had dropped plates in the diner. But the doubts still clung to her, pulling at her confidence like they always did. He sat down across from her, his posture relaxed, but his eyes never leaving her face. "I want to be clear with you, Ellie," he said. "This isn't just about a job. This is about the future. Your future." She looked up at him, feeling the weight of his words. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have the experience, and I've never been in a place like this before." David's gaze softened. "You're more capable than you give yourself credit for. You've already proven that, just by being here, just by getting through everything you've been through. You have everything it takes." Ellie swallowed, the lump in her throat making it hard to speak. She had always told herself she wasn't enough, that she would never be more than the sum of her failures. But there was something in David's words that made her want to believe otherwise. Maybe she could be more. Maybe she was meant for something else. The silence hung between them for a moment, thick and heavy, before David spoke again, his voice steady. "This is your chance, Ellie, if you want it." She looked out the window, the city sprawling before her, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so small. Maybe this was what she had been waiting for. Maybe this was the chance to stop being invisible. With a deep breath, she finally looked back at him, her decision made. "I want it," she said, her voice firm now, the fear still there, but no longer controlling her. She had made it this far. She wasn't going to stop now. The first day at Hayes Enterprises was everything Ellie had expected, and nothing like she imagined. The sleek glass walls of the office tower made her feel small as she entered, the air inside cold, with a kind of sterile professionalism she had only seen in movies. But as she walked into the building, her mind kept reminding her that she was here for a reason, that she had made the choice to step into this world, no matter how out of place it felt. David had greeted her with his usual calm warmth, leading her through the maze of hallways to her new office. It wasn't huge, but it wasn't small either. The desk was clean and modern, the kind of space where people looked important just by sitting at it. Her name, Ellie Monroe, was neatly printed on a small brass plaque on the desk, and it felt surreal to see it there. For a moment, she thought she might be dreaming, but the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint scent of fresh coffee reminded her that this was real. This was happening. The hours blurred as she dove into the work, her hands moving faster than her mind could process. She was given small things, at first updating spreadsheets, answering emails, reviewing reports. Each task felt monumental, each click of the mouse a reminder that she was now part of something she hadn't thought possible. She had spent her life working jobs where the next paycheck was all that mattered, but now she was working for something bigger than that. David's office was just down the hall, but Ellie only saw him a few times during the day. He was always busy, making phone calls, attending meetings, his world so far removed from hers. She couldn't help but wonder how she was supposed to fit into this fast-moving place, where the rules seemed unspoken and the stakes were high. She was just a woman who had worked in a diner, who had done nothing more than survive until this point. But now, here she was, sitting at a desk in a corporate office, trying to make sense of the way everything moved around her. At lunch, she sat alone in the company cafeteria, her food untouched as she watched the employees around Herman and women in tailored suits, discussing budgets and strategy, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They spoke quickly, their conversations flowing seamlessly, while Ellie fumbled to find her place in it all. No one paid her any attention, and she didn't expect them to. She had no reason to be part of their world, not yet. Not until she could prove herself. As she picked at her salad, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen, hoping it was a message from Jamie, but it was a text from David. "How's it going? Need anything?" Ellie's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she replied. "It's good. Busy, but good. Just getting the hang of it." She set the phone down, her fingers trembling slightly. It was strange how much she had come to depend on his reassurance. She'd only known him for a few days, but something about him made her feel like she belonged here, like he believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. She couldn't help but wonder if he saw something in her that no one else had ever noticed. After lunch, the rest of the day passed in a blur. Ellie found herself in meetings with people she didn't know, listening to conversations that felt like they were happening in another language. She was given small tasks shadowing someone on the marketing team, sitting in on conference calls, but no one expected her to contribute much. Not yet. And that was fine. She wasn't ready for that. Not today. She just needed to survive this first week, to prove that she could be here without making a fool of herself. By the time the day ended, Ellie's head was spinning. She had barely spoken to anyone outside of a few brief exchanges. The world of corporate life was a whirlwind, one that moved faster than she could keep up with. But there was something inside her that was beginning to wake up, a spark that had been dormant for so long. Maybe this was where she was supposed to be. Maybe she was meant for more than just cleaning tables and scraping by. As she packed up her things and walked toward the elevator, Ellie caught a glimpse of herself in the glass reflection. Her hair was slightly messy, and she felt as if the weight of the day had settled into her shoulders. But there was something different about the way she looked at herself. It wasn't just exhaustion in her eyes, it was determination. She had made it this far, and she wasn't about to let this opportunity slip away. The elevator ride down was quiet, the city stretching out before her as the doors slid open. She walked out into the cool night air, the streetlights casting long shadows across the sidewalk. As she made her way home, the silence felt different than it had before. It wasn't just the weight of her workday, it was the realization that she was changing, that this life she had fought so hard to escape, this life of barely getting by, was no longer the only option she had. She could do more. She could be more. Ellie pulled her coat tighter around her as she walked, the cool night air a reminder that she was still here, still standing, and still fighting. There was a long road ahead of her, but she was ready for it now. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was starting to live. The second week at Hayes Enterprises felt like stepping deeper into a world that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Ellie had learned the ropes of her new job faster than she'd expected, though she often found herself second-guessing everything. The work was challenging, but that wasn't what made her uneasy. It was the constant question of whether she truly belonged here. Every new task, every interaction with her colleagues, seemed to highlight the vast divide between the world she had come from and the one she was trying to step into. She had made small strides, her confidence building in quiet moments when she finally understood a report or answered a question without hesitation. But the pressure of being the outsider never quite faded. She was still the new girl, the one who had shown up out of nowhere, thrown into a job most people would have worked years to get. There were moments when the weight of it all felt suffocating, as if the walls of the office were closing in on her. One evening, after another long day, she found herself standing in the lobby, waiting for the elevator. Her thoughts were still tangled with the reports she had been reviewing all day, the little mistakes she had made and the subtle glances from some of the senior staff that made her feel like an imposter. As she stood there, lost in thought, a familiar voice interrupted the quiet. "Long day?" Ellie looked up to find David standing beside her, his hands in his pockets, his smile warm, but with an undercurrent of concern. "Yeah," she said, her voice more tired than she intended. "I'm getting the hang of it. But it feels like there's always something new to learn, something I missed." David nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "You're doing great," he said, his voice steady but encouraging. "Everyone feels like that at first. You've got more than most people here already. You've got drive. That's what counts. Ellie forced a smile, though the doubt still lingered in her chest. Thanks. I'm just not sure if I'm moving fast enough. I'm not, like the others here. David didn't respond right away, but his expression softened, and for a moment, Ellie thought he might say something more. Instead, he just stood there with her in the silence, as if letting the words settle between them. Finally he spoke, his tone casual but with a hint of something deeper. You don't have to be like anyone else, he said. You just need to be you. That's why you're here. Ellie didn't know how to respond to that. It wasn't that she didn't believe him, but hearing it from someone who was so far removed from her life was hard to accept. She had spent so many years just trying to keep her head down, to make it through each day without rocking the boat. And now, here she was, in a place where everyone was polished and confident, and she couldn't help but wonder if they saw through her. The elevator doors slid open, interrupting her thoughts. David stepped inside, and she followed, the soft hum of the elevator filling the silence between them. As it descended, Ellie felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. Being near David, talking to him like this, helped more than she cared to admit. There was something in his presence that made her feel less like an outsider, even if just for a moment. When the elevator reached the ground floor, they both stepped out into the lobby. David paused before the doors, turning to her with a faint smile. Want to grab a coffee? He asked. I know a place down the street. It's a bit quieter. Ellie hesitated. She hadn't expected him to ask, and part of her wondered if this was just part of his effort to keep her comfortable, to ease her into the new world she was trying to navigate. But something about the offer made her want to accept. It wasn't about work or expectations, it was about something else, something that made her feel like maybe she wasn't so far from the life she had dreamed of. I'd like that, she said before she could talk herself out of it. They walked together down the street, the city humming around them. As they approached the small cafe, Ellie found herself relaxing, the tension of the office finally slipping away. The place was cozy, the kind of quiet refuge she had always gravitated toward. It wasn't corporate or flashy, just a small shop with mismatched chairs and soft lighting. It felt like the kind of place she could have found in her old neighborhood, tucked away from the world. They ordered coffee and sat down at a corner table, the warm mugs between them offering a small comfort. Ellie wasn't sure what to say, the uncertainty still lingering in her chest. She had gotten used to being careful with her words, measuring every response. But tonight, with David sitting across from her, there was no need to be cautious. You're quiet tonight, David said, studying her with a look that was both knowing and patient. Ellie shrugged, stirring her coffee absently. Just thinking. About what? He asked, his gaze soft but insistent. She looked up at him, her thoughts suddenly more clear. About how different this all is, she said. How out of place I feel sometimes. Like I'm waiting for someone to figure out that I don't belong here. David's expression softened, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. He just watched her, his eyes steady. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. Ellie, he said, his gaze unwavering. You belong here more than most people realize. You've been through things that most people couldn't even begin to imagine. That's why you're here. You've got more to offer than you think. For a moment, the words hung in the air between them, and Ellie felt the weight of them settle deep inside her. She had never thought about it that way. She had spent so long telling herself she wasn't enough, but here, in this moment, she was beginning to see herself differently. Maybe David was right. Maybe she didn't have to fit in with everyone else. Maybe, just maybe, she could carve out a place for herself here, in this world that was so different from the one she had come from. She took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the warm mug, and finally, for the first time since she'd stepped into this new life, she let herself believe it. She could do this. She could be more than she ever imagined. The next few weeks passed in a blur, each day more difficult than the last. Ellie was settling into her new role at Hayes Enterprises, but every step felt like walking on unsteady ground. She was doing the work, learning the systems, becoming familiar with the projects, but the constant weight of self-doubt hung over her. Her colleagues seemed so sure of themselves, so comfortable in their roles. They had been in this world for years, and Ellie often wondered what they thought of her, the woman who had walked in from nowhere, trying to find her place. The tasks they gave her were getting more complicated, but they weren't what weighed on her. It wasn't the work that made her nervous. It was the idea that she was still an outsider, that she had no business being here, no right to take up space in this polished world that had always seemed out of reach. One afternoon, after yet another long meeting that had left her feeling more exhausted than when she walked in, Ellie found herself staring at the small clock on the wall in the break room. She should have been back at her desk by now, but something inside her kept her rooted to the spot. The usual hum of the office, the clicking of keyboards and the low murmur of voices, felt more overwhelming today than it ever had before. She hadn't realized how much she had started to depend on David's encouragement. His reassurance had been like an anchor in the chaos of everything, but lately those moments of calm had become less frequent. He was always busy, always surrounded by people who needed him, and Ellie couldn't help but feel the distance between them growing. She wasn't sure if it was just her, or if he was pulling back, too. The door to the break room opened, and Ellie looked up to find David standing there, a look of mild surprise on his face when he saw her sitting alone. "You look like you've had a long day," he said, his voice light, but there was something in his eyes that told her he could see past the surface. Ellie forced a smile and nodded. "Just tired, I guess." David stepped inside, leaning against the counter as he studied her. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and Ellie felt the familiar tension in her chest. She wasn't sure if it was the weight of the work or the growing silence between them, but she wanted to say something to bridge the gap that had suddenly opened up. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, more careful. Ellie shrugged, looking down at her hands. "Yeah, She paused, not sure how to finish the thought. She didn't want to admit that she was struggling, that every day felt like she was barely keeping up, but the words were already out. "I feel like I don't belong here sometimes." David's expression softened, and he straightened, moving closer to where she sat. "You belong here more than anyone realizes," he said quietly, the sincerity in his voice making her look up. "You've got something that most people don't." Ellie shook her head, the familiar wave of doubt creeping in. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I keep waiting for someone to figure out that I don't know what I'm doing." David smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile she expected. It wasn't the easy, charming smile he usually wore. It was something more genuine, something that reached his eyes. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there, watching her. Then he spoke again, his voice steady. "You're here because you're capable, Ellie," he said. "You wouldn't be here if you didn't have what it takes. You're doing more than just surviving, you're thriving, even if you don't see it yet." Ellie felt a strange mix of warmth and discomfort at his words. She wanted to believe him, but it was hard. She wasn't used to people telling her she was more than she believed herself to be. It felt foreign, unreal, and yet standing here with him, she felt a part of herself start to shift. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words coming out softer than she intended. "I don't know what I'd do without you." David's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Ellie saw something more in his eyes, something that felt more than just gratitude or encouragement. It was a look that made her heart beat a little faster, but she quickly pushed it aside. This wasn't the time, not here, not now. "You're doing just fine," he said, his voice steady, but still carrying that quiet warmth. "I believe in you." She nodded, unsure of what else to say. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. Ellie stood up, the sudden movement making her feel self-conscious. She wasn't sure what was happening between them, but she couldn't shake the feeling that things were starting to change in ways she didn't fully understand. David gave her a small, reassuring smile before stepping back. "I'll let you get back to it. We'll talk more soon, okay? Ellie nodded, watching him walk out of the break room and disappear down the hallway. She stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her, her heart still racing. She didn't know what she was doing, or what was happening with David, but for the first time in a long time, she felt something stirring inside her. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just the possibility that she could be more than what she had always thought she was. As she walked back to her desk, the weight of the office seemed a little less heavy. There were still doubts, still questions that lingered in the back of her mind, but for the first time in a while, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she was starting to find her place. The next few days felt like they were moving at a pace she couldn't quite keep up with. Ellie found herself caught between the weight of her work and the weight of her own thoughts, trying to navigate the space between the world she had left behind and the one she was trying to build. Every moment at Hayes Enterprises felt like a test, every interaction, every project a reminder that she was still the new girl, still learning how to fit into a world that had always seemed so distant. But there were moments, fleeting and rare, when she felt like she was finally starting to understand. The work was starting to make sense, the tasks less overwhelming. She had even begun to make small connections with some of her colleagues, people who, despite their polished exteriors, seemed to welcome her into their orbit. The office no longer felt as cold and unfamiliar as it once had, and for the first time in a long time, Ellie began to see a future here. Still, there were days when she found herself standing in front of the mirror before leaving for work, her reflection staring back at her with a mixture of uncertainty and resolve. She didn't know what it was about this job, about this new life, that made her feel so out of place and yet so drawn to it. Every time she thought she had it figured out, a new challenge would arise, pulling her back into that old feeling of being on the outside looking in. That morning, as she walked into the office, she was met with the usual buzz of activity. The usual crowd of people, each absorbed in their own conversations or work, and Ellie made her way to her desk, her mind still cluttered with thoughts of everything that was waiting for her to do. She had just sat down when a soft knock on her door made her look up. It was David. His presence, though familiar now, still made her heart race a little faster than it should have. There was something about the way he carried himself, confident but not overbearing, attentive without being intrusive, that always seemed to draw her in. Today, however, there was something different about him. His usual easy smile was replaced with a more serious expression, and his eyes, which usually held a lightness, were focused in a way that made her wonder what was going on in his mind. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. Ellie straightened up in her chair, suddenly aware of how disheveled her desk had become in the rush of the morning. "Of course," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. David took a seat across from her, his gaze still steady. He didn't speak right away, as if he was weighing his words carefully. Ellie waited, the silence between them stretching a little longer than was comfortable. Finally, he broke it. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something," he began. "Something that's come up. It's about your position here." Her heart skipped a beat. She had expected something like this to happen, but hearing him say it made her nervous, unsure of what he meant. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice a little quieter than she intended. David shook his head. No problem. Quite the opposite, actually. You've been doing great. Everyone is really impressed with how quickly you've picked things up." He paused, his eyes searching hers, as if he were trying to decide how much to reveal. "But there's something else. I've been talking to a few people about expanding your role here, maybe taking on something bigger, something with more responsibility." Ellie blinked, the words taking a moment to register. She had expected feedback, maybe more projects, but not this. "You mean—" She stopped herself, unsure if she was hearing him right. David nodded, a small, encouraging smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yes. There's a new project coming up, and I think you'd be perfect for it. It's a big step, but I believe you're ready." The words hung in the air between them, and Ellie found herself unable to speak for a moment. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't ready, that she didn't know enough to take on something bigger, that she wasn't sure she could handle it. But as she sat there looking at David, she realized something. He was offering her a chance. He was offering her something she hadn't even dared to ask for, and she didn't want to waste it. "That's a lot," she said finally, her voice softer now, as she let the idea settle in her mind. "I'm honored, but—" "No buts," David interrupted gently. "You've proven that you can handle more. This is just the next step." Ellie sat back in her chair, her mind racing. This was what she had wanted, wasn't it? To be more than just a waitress, to be more than the woman who was barely scraping by. But now that the opportunity was in front of her, she found herself questioning whether she could truly step up. She had never been one to believe in her own potential, always too afraid to take that leap, always too afraid to believe she was worth more than the life she had known. "I don't know," she said quietly, her eyes on her hands. "I don't know if I'm ready for this. I've never done anything like it before." David's gaze softened, his voice firm but kind. "You're more than ready, Ellie. You just have to believe that." She took a deep breath, the weight of his words sinking in. Maybe she was ready. Maybe she didn't have to be perfect, didn't have to have it all figured out. Maybe, just maybe, she could do this. "Okay," she said finally, her voice stronger than it had been moments ago. "I'll do it." David smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Good. I knew you would." As he stood to leave, Ellie sat there for a moment, her heart still pounding in her chest. She didn't know what this new opportunity would bring or what challenges lay ahead, but one thing was clear. She was no longer the woman who had walked into this building uncertain of her place. She was someone who could take on whatever came her way. And for the first time in a long time, Ellie felt a flicker of excitement, of possibility. The road ahead wasn't easy, but she was ready to walk it. Ellie woke early the next morning, the weight of the decision from the day before settling over her like a blanket she couldn't quite shake off. She had agreed to take on more responsibility at work, to step up in a way she had never done before, and though the excitement had flared briefly when she made the choice, it was now replaced with the heavy realization that she had no idea what she was walking into. The new project that David had mentioned was a step into unfamiliar territory, and as much as she tried to tell herself that she could do it, there was a knot of fear twisting in her stomach. She got Jamie ready for school, each task mechanical as she moved through the motions. The morning was the same as any other, with Jamie asking the usual questions about his day and Ellie replying with the practiced calm of a mother who had learned how to keep her worries hidden. But inside, her mind was already on the office, already dreading what the next step would look like. After dropping Jamie off at school, Ellie made her way to Hayes Enterprises, her feet moving on autopilot, the familiar streets seeming both comforting and distant all at once. She tried to focus on the things she could control, the small victories from her past few weeks at the office, the fact that she had learned so much already. But the closer she got to the building, the more the doubt crept in. She wasn't sure if she belonged here. She wasn't sure if she could pull off the next step, the next phase of her life. When she arrived at the office, she was greeted by the usual buzz of activity. The place was always alive with movement, people rushing around, their conversations filling the air with a constant hum of business. Ellie walked to her desk, her heart beating faster with every step. She could feel the eyes on her some of her colleagues passing by, their glances quick and distracted, but she couldn't help but wonder what they were thinking. She wasn't like them. She hadn't spent years climbing the ladder, hadn't worked her way up in this world. She had stumbled into it, and now it felt as if the world was waiting for her to prove she belonged. As she sat down at her desk, she was met by the familiar sight of emails, reports, and messages. The work that had once seemed like a mountain now seemed like a familiar, if exhausting, climb. But today, there was a new task waiting for her. The project David had mentioned was finally starting to take shape, and she was going to be a part of it. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but there was no turning back now. The morning passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and emails. Ellie moved through it all with a quiet determination, but the doubt still lingered, like a shadow she couldn't outrun. At lunch, she sat alone in the cafeteria, her food untouched as her thoughts swirled around the unknowns of the project. She had never taken on something this big before. She had never been in charge of anything beyond her own life, beyond the small circle of her family and the diner she had worked in for so long. But when she returned to her desk after lunch, there was a message waiting for her. It was from David. "We need to talk. Come to my office after you finish for the day." The words sent a jolt of nervousness through her, her stomach tightening as she wondered what he wanted. She had seen him earlier, but there hadn't been any mention of anything urgent. The uncertainty started to spiral, and her mind raced with possibilities. Had she made a mistake? Was this project too much for her? What if she wasn't cut out for this after all? By the end of the day, the office had quieted down, the usual buzz fading as the workday wound down. Ellie gathered her things, trying to push aside the nervous energy that was making her heart race. When she arrived at David's office, she knocked lightly on the door before stepping inside. He was sitting behind his desk, his expression focused but not unkind. "Ellie," he said with a nod, gesturing for her to sit. "How's everything going?" Ellie sat down, her hands folded in her lap. "Good," she replied, though the word felt empty in her mouth. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to say. She had so many questions, so many doubts, but they were all tangled together in a knot that was too tight to unravel. David studied her for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Then he leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady but not unkind. "I wanted to talk to you about the project," he said. "I think you're ready to take on more responsibility, but I also want to make sure you feel prepared. This is a big step, Ellie, and I want you to know that you don't have to do it alone." The reassurance in his voice, the quiet confidence he had in her, made her feel a little lighter, but the fear still lingered. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never done anything like this before. I don't want to mess it up." David smiled softly, his eyes warm with understanding. "You've already proven that you can handle more than you think. This project isn't about perfection, Ellie. It's about learning, growing. And you have all the tools you need to succeed. I wouldn't have put you on this if I didn't believe in you." His words settled over her like a blanket, comforting in a way she hadn't expected. She had always been afraid of failing, afraid of not being enough. But here, in this moment, she realized that failing wasn't the end. It was just another step forward. "Thank you," she said quietly, her heart swelling with something she couldn't quite define. Gratitude, yes, but also something else. Something that felt like the beginning of belief, not just in David's words, but in her own ability to rise to the challenge. David gave her a nod, his smile gentle. "You're going to do great, Ellie. Just trust yourself." As she left his office, Ellie felt the weight of the day lift off her shoulders. There were still challenges ahead, still doubts she would have to face, but for the first time in a long time she felt ready. Ready to take on whatever came next. The following weeks blurred together, each one marked by the steady rhythm of deadlines and the constant hum of activity at Hayes Enterprises. Ellie had thrown herself into the project with everything she had, tackling each task with a focus that left little room for doubt. There were moments when she felt like she was in over her head, but she kept pushing forward, reminding herself that this was what she had signed up for. She was no longer just the outsider. She was a part of something bigger now, and with each small success, she felt herself inching closer to a version of herself she wasn't sure she had ever truly believed in. Still, as much as she had grown, as much as she had proven to herself that she was capable, there was always the nagging feeling that she wasn't quite enough. There were days when the weight of the office, the pressure of expectations felt unbearable, and Ellie found herself questioning whether she belonged here at all. But she buried the fear deep, keeping it hidden behind the smile she had learned to wear so well. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Ellie was sitting at her desk, reviewing a report that had taken far longer than she had anticipated. The office was quieter now, most people having left for the day. She had stayed behind to finish up, as she often did, and the silence in the building made her feel more isolated than usual. She looked around the empty office, the shadows stretching across the polished floors, and for a moment, the weight of everything seemed to settle in her chest. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't hear the soft knock on her door until it came again, this time a little louder. She looked up, startled, and found David standing in the doorway. His presence was like a breath of fresh air, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this after all. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice casual, though there was an underlying note of concern in his eyes. Ellie nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just trying to finish this report. It's taking longer than I thought." David stepped inside, his gaze moving from the report to her face. "You've been working pretty hard," he said, his voice softening. "Maybe it's time to take a break." Ellie didn't respond right away, but the suggestion of rest made her realize just how exhausted she truly was. She had been so focused on proving herself that she had forgotten to take a step back. Her shoulders were tense, her eyes dry from staring at the screen for hours, and she felt the weight of the last few weeks pressing against her chest. "I'm fine," she said quickly, not wanting to seem weak, but the exhaustion in her voice betrayed her. "I just need to finish this, and then I'll head home." David walked closer, his eyes studying her with a quiet intensity. "Ellie," he said, his tone firm but not unkind, "you're doing great, but you can't keep going like this. You need to take care of yourself, too." She met his gaze, something in his words reaching her in a way she hadn't expected. She had been so caught up in the rush of work, so focused on the idea of success, that she had forgotten how to listen to her own body, how to recognize when she was running on empty. David reached for her desk, gently nudging the report aside. "Take a break. I'll be here if you need anything." Ellie hesitated, but his calm presence made it hard to resist. Slowly, she stood up, stretching her stiff limbs as she looked at him. "I guess a break wouldn't hurt," she admitted, her voice softer now. David smiled, that same reassuring smile that always seemed to calm her nerves. "Good. Come on, let's get out of here for a bit." They walked down the hall together, the silence between them comfortable in a way that made Ellie feel lighter than she had in weeks. They didn't talk much, there was no need to fill the quiet with words. Just being in each other's company was enough. They made their way to a small cafe down the street, a place Ellie had passed by countless times but never had the chance to stop at. The moment they walked in, the warm smell of coffee and baked goods filled the air, the soft hum of conversation a pleasant contrast to the sterile quiet of the office. David led her to a corner booth, where they sat down, the low lighting casting soft shadows around them. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ellie felt like she could breathe. The tension in her shoulders began to ease, and for a few moments she allowed herself to forget about the weight of the office, the pressure of the project. She glanced at David, who was watching her with a thoughtful expression. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I keep trying to keep up, but some days it just feels like too much." David's gaze softened, and he leaned forward slightly. "You don't have to have all the answers, Ellie. No one does. What matters is that you're here, that you're doing your best. And that's enough." Ellie felt a warmth spread through her chest, his words sinking deep into her heart. She had been so afraid of failing, so afraid of not measuring up. But hearing him say that, hearing him believe in her when she wasn't sure she believed in herself, made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as lost as she thought. "You really think that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, a hint of vulnerability slipping through. David nodded, his smile gentle. "I know it." For the first time in a long time, Ellie felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be, not because everything was perfect, but because she was doing the best she could, and that was enough. They spent the next hour, talking about work, about life, about things that had nothing to do with the office. And as the evening wore on, Ellie realized that she had forgotten what it felt like to just be present, to enjoy the small moments without worrying about everything she hadn't done yet. As they left the cafe and walked back to the office, the city around them buzzing with life, Ellie felt something shift inside her. She wasn't sure what the future held, or what challenges were waiting for her, but for the first time, in a long time, she felt like she could face them. She wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. Ellie's life had begun to settle into a rhythm she never expected. The work was challenging, yes, but there was a comfort now in the chaos. The uncertainty that had once gripped her every step was slowly giving way to confidence. She had moments when the pressure seemed overwhelming, when her mind raced with the idea that she was still an imposter in this world. But there were also moments, quiet moments, when she allowed herself to breathe and realize that maybe she was capable of more than she thought. The project David had put her in charge of was progressing well. Ellie had taken on more responsibility with each passing week, and though there were bumps along the way, she was learning how to handle them with a calm she didn't know she had. The team had started to trust her, to rely on her for their ideas and input, and while she wasn't yet the leader she aspired to be, she was well on her way. But no matter how much she accomplished, no matter how many hurdles she cleared, there was always a part of her that still felt like she was standing on the edge of something she might not be able to cross. It wasn't the work itself that made her feel this way. It was the growing distance between her and the life she had left behind the world she had come from. Sometimes, when she looked at her colleagues, she could feel the gap between them, the invisible line that separated her from their world of privilege and ease. It was another late night at the office, long after everyone else had left, when Ellie found herself at her desk, staring at a report that seemed to be getting more complicated with each passing minute. She had promised herself she would finish it tonight, but the words on the screen seemed to blur together, her focus drifting as her mind wandered. She thought about Jamie, how he was growing so fast, how much he depended on her. She thought about her old life, about the diner and the long hours she used to spend there, serving people who barely saw her. There had been days when she had felt invisible, when the world seemed so big and she was so small in it. But now she was someone who could make a difference. She was part of something that mattered, and in some small way that made everything else feel worth it. The sound of the office door opening broke her from her thoughts, and she looked up to see David standing there, his figure framed by the doorway. He was dressed as he always was, sharp, confident, but there was something about the way he stood there, the way his eyes searched hers, that made Ellie's heart beat a little faster. "Still here?" he asked, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Ellie smiled, though it was a little weary. "Yeah, just trying to get this finished." David walked toward her desk, his footsteps soft against the floor. He paused beside her chair, his presence close but not intrusive. "You've been working a lot lately," he said, his tone more serious now, the playful edge gone. "You're pushing yourself too hard. You need to take a break." Ellie shook her head, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The truth was, she hadn't been fine for a while. She was exhausted, but she couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. There was too much at stake. "I just want to finish this." David didn't say anything at first, but she could see the concern in his eyes. He reached out, his hand resting lightly on the back of her chair, a quiet comfort in the gesture. "You've done more than enough," he said softly. "You're making progress. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Ellie." She looked up at him then, her heart unexpectedly heavy. It wasn't the words themselves, she had heard similar things from him before. It was the way he said them, the quiet sincerity in his voice that made her realize just how much she had been holding inside. She had been so focused on proving herself, on making sure everyone saw her as capable, as worthy of the position she had fought for, that she had forgotten to take care of the most important part of all, herself. David's gaze softened, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside seemed to disappear, and in the stillness of the office, Ellie felt a wave of emotion she hadn't expected. She had spent so long afraid of failing, afraid of not being good enough. But standing here, with David by her side, she realized that maybe it wasn't about being perfect. Maybe it was about being human, about acknowledging the struggle and still showing up anyway. "I'm not perfect," she said quietly, almost to herself, but David heard her. He nodded, his voice gentle. "None of us are, but that doesn't mean we're not doing the best we can." Ellie smiled then, her heart lightening just a little, the weight of her fears slipping away, if only for a moment. She was doing the best she could, and maybe that was enough. David gave her a small nod and stepped back, turning toward the door. "Get some rest tonight, okay? You've earned it." She nodded, grateful for his words, for the way he seemed to see her in a way no one else did. "Thanks," she said, her voice sincere. As he walked out, leaving her alone in the quiet office once more, Ellie sat there for a moment, letting his words sink in. She wasn't sure what the future held, or how much further she would have to go to prove her worth. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so alone in the struggle. She was part of something bigger now, and that made all the difference. The office was quiet when Ellie arrived the next morning, the usual buzz of activity absent in the early hours. She liked it this way, the silence that allowed her to think, to prepare herself for the day ahead. It had been weeks since she had started the project, and though she had come a long way, there were still moments when she felt like she was standing on the edge, looking out at a world she wasn't sure she belonged in. But each step forward, each small victory, had pushed her closer to something she hadn't quite understood yet. Confidence, maybe, or just the knowledge that she was doing the best she could. She sat down at her desk, her fingers already hovering over the keyboard as she scanned her emails. The usual requests, the usual updates, all things she had grown accustomed to handling. The work had become familiar, comforting in its rhythm, but she still felt the pull of doubt now and then. She wasn't used to this, wasn't used to being in charge of something this important. But she had made it this far, and that was something, wasn't it? The door to the office opened, and Ellie looked up to see David standing in the doorway. He had been busy lately, tied up in meetings and conference calls, his presence at the office less frequent than it had been before. But there he was, standing with that same calm confidence that had always seemed to anchor her in the storm of her own doubts. "Morning," he said with a smile, his eyes immediately finding hers. "How's everything going?" Ellie straightened in her chair, pushing aside the stray thoughts that had been clouding her mind. "Good," she said, offering a small smile in return. "Busy, but good. I'm almost done with the latest draft for the project. Just need a few more tweaks." David stepped into the room, his presence filling the space in a way that made her feel both comforted and a little nervous. He had always been a quiet anchor, someone who had seen something in her when she hadn't seen it in herself. But lately, there was something different in the way he looked at her, a tension that wasn't there before, something unspoken that made Ellie's heart beat just a little faster. "You're doing great, Ellie," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of something softer underneath. "You've come a long way. I've been getting positive feedback from the team, and I'm really impressed with how you've handled everything." Ellie's stomach fluttered at the praise, but she quickly brushed it aside, focusing on the work in front of her. "Thanks. I've just been trying to keep up, you know." David nodded, walking over to the window that overlooked the city below. The sun had started to rise, casting a warm glow over the buildings. "I know it's not easy," he said, his voice quieter now, more contemplative. "But you've done more than just keep up. You've taken charge of something important. You've proven you can handle it." Ellie's breath caught at his words. She wasn't used to hearing such direct praise, especially from someone like David, someone she respected so much. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, unsure of how to respond, unsure of how to deal with the feeling that was growing inside her, something between pride and something else she wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. David turned away from the window and looked at her, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "Ellie," he said, his tone shifting, becoming more serious. "There's something I need to talk to you about. It's about the project." She looked up at him, her pulse quickening. "What about it?" David walked toward her, stopping just a few feet from her desk. He hesitated for a moment, as if deciding how to continue. "I've been thinking about the direction this project is taking, and I think it's time we bring you into the next phase, take it to the next level. You've earned it." Ellie blinked, her mind racing to catch up with his words. "The next phase?" she repeated, her voice unsure. David nodded, his expression steady. "Yes, I think it's time we start giving you more responsibility. I want you to take the lead on the next set of meetings, work directly with the senior team to finalize the details. This project is yours now, Ellie." The words hit her like a wave, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. She had always been afraid of taking that step, afraid of stepping into a role where people expected more of her. She had always played it safe, doing what was asked of her without rocking the boat, but now David was giving her the reins, asking her to lead. "I don't know," Ellie said, her voice soft with uncertainty. "I've never led something like this before. What if I mess it up?" David's gaze softened, and he stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. "You won't mess it up. You've already proven yourself, Ellie. You've handled everything that's come your way, and you'll handle this too." Her heart hammered in her chest, but something inside her stirred. Maybe it was the quiet certainty in his voice, or maybe it was the fact that he believed in her when she didn't always believe in herself. Either way, Ellie felt a shift inside her, a change that was slowly pushing aside the doubts that had always held her back. "Okay," she said, her voice steadier now. "I'll do it." David smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing as he nodded. "I knew you would." Ellie sat back in her chair, the weight of his words sinking in. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when everything she had worked for was finally within reach. She didn't know if she was ready, but she knew she had to try. And with David's support, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could make it happen. As the sun continued to rise outside, casting long shadows across the office, Ellie felt a quiet sense of possibility settle over her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was starting to thrive. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe she was exactly where she was meant to be. The days leading up to the final presentation of the project felt like a blur, each one blending into the next as Ellie put every ounce of energy into making sure everything was perfect. The pressure was mounting, the weight of expectation heavier than she had ever felt before. The senior team was counting on her to pull everything together, and though she had grown into the role, the fear of failure still lingered at the edges of her thoughts. She had worked so hard, learned so much, but was it enough? Could she really handle the responsibility she had been given? Each morning, she woke up earlier than usual, spending extra time reviewing every detail, making sure everything was in place. She had become a fixture in the office, her desk a constant hub of activity, her focus unyielding as she tried to prepare herself for what was to come. David had been a quiet but consistent presence, offering guidance when needed but always letting her take the lead. His belief in her had been unwavering, and that belief had slowly started to seep into her own confidence, giving her the strength to keep moving forward. But the closer the presentation came, the more Ellie felt herself holding her breath. She wasn't sure if it was the enormity of the task or the fear that she might not be able to live up to the expectations that had been placed on her. She had always kept her head down, working in the background, never drawing too much attention to herself. But now, she was standing in front of a team of people who would decide her future, and the thought of disappointing them terrified her. It was the night before the presentation when Ellie found herself back at her desk, the office quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. She had been reviewing the final slides one last time when she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. She looked up, surprised to find David standing there, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "You still here?" he asked, his voice light but with a hint of concern. Ellie smiled, tiredly, pushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Yeah, just going over the presentation one more time." David stepped closer, his eyes scanning the screen in front of her. "You've done the work, Ellie," he said, his voice soft but steady. "This is your moment. You're ready." Ellie swallowed, the lump in her throat threatening to choke her. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking that I've missed something, that I'm not going to be enough." David's expression softened, and he took a step closer to her, his presence calming in a way that only he could. "You are enough," he said firmly. "You've proven that already. I've watched you grow, Ellie. I've watched you take this project and make it your own. And I know that tomorrow you'll show everyone what you're capable of." Ellie looked up at him, her heart beating faster at the sincerity in his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that she had done enough, but the fear still lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. "You've been amazing through all of this," David continued, his voice low and steady. "And tomorrow is just another step in your journey. No matter what happens, you've already accomplished something most people would never even try." She felt a lump form in her throat as his words sank in, the weight of the pressure easing ever so slightly. David had always believed in her, even when she hadn't believed in herself. And now, standing here, with his encouragement surrounding her like a protective shield, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she was ready. "Thanks," she said, her voice quiet but full of gratitude. "For everything." David smiled, the warmth in his eyes making her chest tighten with something she couldn't quite name. "You've got this," he said softly, his tone reassuring. "And no matter what happens tomorrow, I'm proud of you." Ellie looked at him, her heart swelling with something more than just the relief of his support. She hadn't realized how much she had come to depend on his belief in her, how much she had come to trust him not just as a colleague, but as someone who had been there for her in ways she hadn't expected. She had grown so much, but she also realized that, in some ways, she had been leaning on him more than she had allowed herself to admit. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said, her voice steady now, a quiet resolve settling in her chest. David nodded, his smile lingering a moment longer before he turned and walked out of the office, leaving Ellie alone with her thoughts. The next morning arrived too quickly, the office bustling with activity as the team gathered for the presentation. Ellie's stomach twisted with nerves, but as she stood before the room, the weight of the moment didn't feel quite as heavy as it had the night before. She had worked for this. She had prepared for this. And, as she began to speak, laying out the details of the project, the plan, and the vision for what was to come, she realized something. She was exactly where she needed to be. This was her moment. As she finished presenting, the room fell silent for a moment, the tension palpable, and then, slowly, the senior team began to nod in approval, their expressions shifting from skepticism to recognition. Ellie felt a wave of relief wash over her as the feedback started coming in positive, encouraging, and full of praise for the work she had done. By the end of the meeting, the tension had completely lifted, replaced by a sense of accomplishment that Ellie hadn't known she was capable of. She had done it. She had faced her fears, stepped into the role she had been given, and delivered something that would shape her future. As she walked back to her desk, her heart still racing from the adrenaline, she found David standing there, waiting for her. He didn't need to say anything. The look in his eyes, the small, proud smile on his face, said everything she needed to hear. "You did it," he said quietly, his voice filled with pride. Ellie smiled, feeling the weight of the last few months finally lift from her shoulders. "We did it," she corrected him, her voice full of gratitude and something else, something that felt like the beginning of a new chapter. And for the first time in a long time, Ellie felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be.